We have 2 young children under 10, one's 6, one's 10 at private schools. My parents are currently trying to build in an over 55 complex, which keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back because of all this. And perhaps most offensively, my husband drives this massive US Chevy, so with the fuel prices right now, cost him $20 to get out the driveway. But the good thing though, and we talk about reframing, is that I no longer have to say that my husband is going through a midlife crisis with this enormous Chevy. He's going through a great realignment. So thank you very much for that positive twist on things. So it's wonderful to be here today. I know many of your faces. I've spoken at a number of schools and a number of conferences with a lot of you. So you guys, I'm sorry you've got to suffer through this talk again, but you'll do really well at the quiz at the end, as you know. I'm just joking, there's no quiz. But what you will have to suffer through is my sense of humour and my terrible repeated jokes through the rest of this. But it really does give me great honour and great privilege to be here to talk about 2 of my all-time favourite subjects, and that is our extraordinary and incredible brain and mind on the one hand, and our magnificent God on the other. And I love the fact that I get to stand on this platform, I guess literally as well as figuratively, that I get to speak about, my faith, that I get to talk about wearing 2 hats, both as a neuroscientist but also as a passionate Christian. And it's not something that I always get to do. I work in, a lot of clinical and scientific spaces, and I talk a lot about the brain and mind and all things clinical, but what I often don't get to do is, I sort of see it as a bit 2-dimensional, 1-dimensional even, that, we don't get to bring that layer of faith, and I feel so passionate and so excited when I can bring that layer of, faith into it. It really does bring it to sort of the next level and add this really incredible dimension to, the importance of how God has designed us, in brain and mind and in our spirit to really, I guess, build a relationship with Him and how we thrive when we're in this loving relationship with Him. So of course it's not just the brain. Yes, I'm a neuroscientist. I deal with the fleshy substance of the brain every day, and I have done for many years. But it's not just the brain, but also the mind, because indeed the mind, which is housed in that sort of that lumpy flesh, between our ears, is actually, if you think about it, the thing that defines who we are in character. It's the thing that defines who we are as a person. Indeed, Proverbs 23 says, "For as a person thinks in his heart, so is he." For as a person thinks, so is he. You see, the mind is an incredibly powerful, we can think about it like a control tower. It's an incredibly powerful thing that has an enormous power over our lives, and not just our lives, but the lives of the people around us, who we interact with, who we live with, who we work with, who we relate to. Everything in life, the words we speak, the choices we make, our actions, our reactions, our behaviours, our relationships, our worldviews, how we perceive the economic downturn, all of this manifests from our mind, from our thinking. And if you think about it, I talk about this being extremely powerful over our lives. The average adult will have around 70,000 individual thoughts a day. So if you're a woman, you'll have about 20,000 of those at once. It's our superpower and our nemesis at the same time. But really what we give our mental attention to is what we will harness and what we will develop in our life. I'll say that again. What we give our mental attention to is what we will develop in our life. For example, if we only focus on the negative and the negative things, the problems and the conflicts in our life and what's going on around us and the things both in our control and especially out of our control, we become negative people. Everything, including our conversations and the relationships we have, become negative, and we actually lose the capacity to think in a positive, life-giving way. And I don't just mean mentally and spiritually, but I mean biologically, we actually lose the capacity to think in positive, life-giving ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But conversely, a healthy brain and a healthy mind is able to harness positive thinking and this sort of life-giving thinking. Again, at the biological level, we'll talk about the fertilizer of the brain being positive thinking, and how this is intimately connected in a healthy spirituality as well. And that a healthy spirituality leads to a healthy brain and a healthy mind, and these three seemingly disparate things actually fit together really beautifully. And if you have ever wondered, like I once did, and doubted even, like I certainly did at one point during my spiritual journey, if science and faith can really coexist and complement each other and reconcile, then I'm just going to ask you this, to just give me the next 45 minutes of your time this afternoon, and I will reveal to you some of the breathtaking and unequivocal ways in which science and faith really do go hand in hand in what I call this perfect union. They really do feed into each other. So what I'm going to do is pull these apart. I'm going to talk about the mind, and then the brain, and then the mind, and then faith, and then I'm going to bring them all together and show you that this really is a perfect marriage and a perfect union. So we'll do that in the next 45 minutes or so fasten your seatbelts. Okay, so a bit of a throwback to uni lecturing days. I think I always like to give you a bit of an overview on where we're going. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the extraordinary brain and some of the amazing facts and figures and some of the building blocks, I guess, to think about, well, how does the brain work, how is it constructed, and how do we think? If we're talking about the mind and we're talking about gaining control over positive thinking, well, what is a thought? What does that even mean? Where does it come from and how does it work? How do we get a tangible, understanding of what a thought is? And I also believe that I think, having an understanding of that, the building blocks and the 101 of the biology of the brain will help you then, I guess, apply some of those principles of healthy living into, thinking healthy and living healthily into your own lives and into your own daily practice. We'll talk about optimizing brain health, some of the things that we can do, because I think it's really important to talk about brain health. It's not, spirituality isn't just confined to our mind and our spirit. It's also part of the body. God wants us to steward our bodies well. And in 1 Corinthians, it says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? Honour God with your bodies. You see, He wants you to live your best life, and in your roles especially, be doing God's work as His hands and feet on earth. But in order to do that, we need to have a healthy vehicle, and a healthy vessel to be able to do that. So we will talk about that, and then of course we'll move into renewing your mind, taking control of that thinking, taking dominion over the way we think. And when I talk about faith, I don't just mean whether we believe in a God or not, but faith is this idea of what is the very essence of the relationship and the intimacy and the connection that we have with God, and the power of prayer. And I'm going to show you some of this research that's come through in the last decade or so on the power of prayer and how it actually changes the substance of the brain and the mind. And this is sort of real, not just Dr. Google, but this is being done in universities and hospitals over in the US, and it's really exciting stuff. So I like to think about it as creating fertile soil. So the same as the parable of the sowing of the seeds, even if we're throwing the best seeds into the ground, the Holy Spirit can't work unless there's a fertile soil there. And I think it's the same with your brain. If your brain is not healthy and it's not thinking well, then it's really, you're not going to have the soil for the healthy thinking and the soil for the Holy Spirit to come in and do His work. So if you just sort of keep that in mind, I guess, is a bit of a principle. So the extraordinary brain. Well, what can I say? I like to think of it as the true masterpiece of God's creation. And I work with a lot of pure scientists, and I have over the years, and I think a pure scientist would tell you, so a non-spiritual scientist, would tell you that this thing here, this lump of flesh between our ears, this is an exact replica of an adult human brain, so it's exactly this size. And it's all very recognisable, even though I dare say none of you have ever seen one in real life in the flesh. I've seen plenty, and it's not this clean and this pretty looking. It's a lot mushier and more bloody, but certainly a pure scientist will tell you that this machine here, this thinking, feeling, living apparatus, is no more than the result of many millions of random chance genetic mutations over many, many millions of years, that we've basically evolved from something akin to pond scum, a single cell amoeboid, and over all of these changes and this random chance, it's almost as if by accident or by chance, we've evolved into this exquisite organ and this exquisite being. But what I can say after working in 20 years of neuroscience and still not even scratching the surface, if I'm honest, about what there is to know about the human brain. What I do know about the human brain is just that it's unfathomable to think that this has just evolved from an amoeboid. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and I hope maybe you'll get some appreciation when we look at it in terms of the world's most powerful supercomputer. So you've probably heard of the human brain being talked about as, you know, the human supercomputer. I think when we really start to compare the two, though, we'll look at the Fugaku supercomputer. So this is housed in Japan, in, it doesn't matter what city it is, Kobe, Japan, so I like detail. So it's been crowned the most powerful computer on Earth. It's designed by Raken and Fujitsu. And when we think about the power of a supercomputer, we talk about processing speed. So how many bits of data can a computer process, over 1 second? So that's the bytes part, the bits. And then there's the storage capacity. So when we look at the processing speed, so this is really, how do we measure the power of the supercomputer? The supercomputer can carry out 415 petaflops. Isn't that amazing? 415 petaflops. No, you're not supposed to know what that means. Essentially, the supercomputer can carry out 415 quadrillion computations per second, which is basically like writing the number 415 with 24 zeros after it. That's how many computations this computer can carry out in a second. To put that into human terms, if you were to calculate, and when I say calculations, it's like your neurons are firing, even just to be upright right now and listening hopefully, and awake hopefully, your heart's beating, your lungs are breathing, your muscles are all, contracted and relaxed in the right sort of configuration to keep you sitting upright. All of these things are going on right now as you're sitting here. If you were to carry out one of those calculations per second, right, so how many, 415 petaflops, it would take you 18 billion years to calculate manually what the Fugaku supercomputer can do in 1 second. It's extraordinary, and humans have built this, and we've done pretty well for pond scum, haven't we, to be able to build a computer this powerful. But the human brain is about 5 times faster than that, at least, as far as our calculations go so far. But at the very least, it's 5 times faster than that. But then you look at the storage capacity, and we know that the Fugaku supercomputer has around, I always have to write these down because I can never remember, I'm not a numbers person, 5 petabytes. So 5.6 million gigabytes is what this computer can store at any one time. So that's 5.6 million billion bits of data. But given the dynamic nature of the brain and that we're constantly changing and rewiring, neuroscientists and many learned academics have actually estimated that the storage capacity of the human brain is actually more like limitless. That actually there is no limit to the amount of information that we can store inside our brains. Now, recall might be an issue on some of those facts and figures, but certainly we have this unbelievable capacity for learning, for processing information. But then you look at the scale, right? So every single one of us has this supercomputer inside our skull that runs rings around the world's most powerful computer, yet it takes an entire warehouse. So there's 160,000 individual nodes. You can see there's a man there at the bottom to give you some scale as to how big these machines are. But then right down, I don't know if you've seen it yet, where the yellow arrow is the human brain put to scale. So now you give me your opinion on whether or not you think this has evolved from pond scum, right? I'm just going to leave that there. That's a debate for another day, but I'm talking to the converted here, literally, aren't I? So let's have a little talk about now what happens when we get under the bonnet. So we know that the human brain is about 2% of your total body weight, so it's a relatively unimposing organ. It doesn't weigh much compared to the rest of your whole body weight. But it consumes an enormous 20% of oxygen that we breathe through respiring, through our lungs, through respiring, and 25% of glucose. And by glucose, I don't just mean by popping lollies and jelly beans, but our body also has a phenomenal capacity. Every individual cell has a capacity to convert the foods we eat and the vitamins and nutrients that we take into its own energy source. But the brain is very greedy. It takes 25% of that, and like I said, 20% of oxygen. But when you start to get below the bonnet and understand at that microscopic level how the neurons work and how the neurons think and what's actually going on inside your skull right now, you'll start to see why this is such an energy-consuming organ. So this here is a picture of two neurons. I very much got down to the molecular and cellular biology of Alzheimer's and some of the other neurological disorders through my PhD and postdoctoral work. And this never ceases to amaze me. This pictures, you know, we talked about the importance of kids and pets on well-being. Well, my phone is filled with pictures of my kids and pets too, but most importantly, lots of neurons, because I find neurons, and I don't know, maybe, you know, Dean, you might want to think about having people bond more with neurons, because they really are, they're wonderful for well-being. They're the most exquisite things when you get to look down the microscope at them. But effectively, so we're able to grow neurons in cultures, so in little petri dishes, and look at them under the microscope. They're extraordinarily small, so you can fit, so these cell bodies, the little white blobs in the middle of the screen are the cell bodies, and all of the growths coming out of them are the neurites, or the arms that they communicate with each other. But each of those cell bodies are about 1/100 of a millimetre across, which means you could fit about 100 neuron cell bodies across the width of a hair. So they're very, very small. But indeed, we have about 100 billion of these in our cortex, in our brain. 100 billion of these, and each one of those can communicate with up to 7,000 other neurons. So you literally have hundreds of trillions of connections in your brain of neurons talking and brain cells talking to each other at any point in time. So you might be starting to get a feel as to why they are such energy-hungry organs. But of course, it's all well and good to look at them individually under a microscope, and they look pretty, and they, you know, you can measure them and do lots of things. But in situ, in your brain, it's a lot more messy and complicated than that. Like I said, hundreds of billions of neurons, hundreds of trillions of connections. But the way they communicate with each other is vital. This is the, sort of where we get into how the thinking and the learning takes place. So neurons inside the brain will communicate with each other through something called electrochemical signaling. So essentially, if you think about a stimulus coming through, let's call it a thought, any kind of thought, will come through, it will stimulate a neuron, which becomes an electrical current. This electrical current will move through the neuron in a speed of about 100 metres a second. When it gets to the end, so you saw the arms, when it gets to the end, the neurons aren't physically connected. They don't have a physical attachment to each other. They have a gap in between, something that's called a synapse. When the electrical signal gets to the end of that neuron, it will actually stimulate the release of a chemical sac called a vesicle, and outside of the vesicle comes these neurotransmitters. You might have heard of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline. So that chemical will cross that gap. The chemical will be taken up by the neuron on the other side of the synapse, will convert that into an electrical signal, spit the electrical signal along, turn that into a chemical signal at the other end, and so on. And this is how it happens. So this is the process of electrochemical signaling. So this is the basis of neural networking, how these neurons speak to each other through electrochemical signaling. What I'm going to do now, and I think it's probably a perfect time to do that because it's that sort of, you know, the blood sugar glucose levels are dropping at about this time of day, and we've been sitting here for a while. I'm going to get everybody up, and together we're going to do neural modelling, neural networking as a team. Okay, so if you all jump to your feet, and this is where the coloured balls come in. So I'm going to start at this end of the room. So effectively you guys are going to model electrochemical signaling. Can you hear me okay still? Yeah. So I'm going to ask just 4 people from this end to choose a different coloured ball each. And what I want them to do is pass that ball one by one. So I don't want anybody to throw the ball. I just want you to pass it to someone close to you, within arm's reach of you, whether it's across the table or to the next table. And I want you to work as a team to move each coloured ball all the way to the other side, to the window, okay? And I want you to remember the pattern that you pass the ball in. This is really important. Okay, so you'd like to choose any colour you like. Okay, so you guys have got yellow, so you can send that one up now to the other end. So the table up by the bay window there is going to collect these. So just remember the pattern that you pass the ball. So choose a different colour. So now we've got green here, excellent. Choose a colour. Blue here, and I think yellow is left.
Yellow.
There we go. All right, pass them up. Okay, red team, are you ready? Yellow. Oh, sorry. Oh, there's 2 yellow. Okay, that's fine. We'll make it work.
I'm part of the
Maybe
yellow.
I don't think anyone's going to do it. No, you've got to go the same. Okay. Okay, yes. So pretend the first one red. Go down the red team, okay? And did you, what colour were you guys? So if you picked the ball out, take the same colour and pass it the same way, who was it? Same colour. Same colour, same people. Same colour, same people. Same colour, same people, all the way. And go again, take another colour. Take the same colour. Here we go. Yellow team.
Another one?
Yep.
Sure. Yellow team's winning right away. Yes. I'm green and yellow.
Yep. Oh, yes. Oh, you're looking. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, and finally, so have you done 2 or 3?
3.
You've done 3. You've done 2. Okay. Yep.
It's not the same people, though, is it?
Okay, red team. Red, you got 3 red up there. And then yellow should be red. Okay, so red team going. Okay, how's the green team going? Good. Yellow team. Blue team. Okay. So while you're doing that, we're going to go all the way to the other end. Stay standing. This is important. There is an old adage or a saying in neuroscience that neurons that fire together will wire together. So if you pass the ball from one person to the next, it's in the same colour, and you're passing that over and over, you're actually forming connections. Those synapses between you are strengthening. That is called neurons that fire together, wire together. So can all those people that touched a ball of any colour stay standing and everyone else sit down? So you're important, you're very important. Okay, so the neurons that fire together. Now I want the red team to join hands in the pattern that you threw it, or past it. And I want the other colour teams to do the same. So yellow, blue, red. Well, some of you may have touched more than 2 balls, which is also very relevant because we know you can connect up to 7,000 others. Okay, so can the red team give me a wave? Nice. Okay. The blue team? Nice. Green team? Nice. Yellow team? Oh, very straight lines. You guys have had very straight lines. Okay, this is great. Okay, so essentially what's happened, you guys have fired together, so you've wired together. Each time you pass the ball, you've strengthened those connections. Unfortunately, the people that haven't had the ball, just like the neurons in your neural network that don't get any input, if they're not used, they're lost. So this is the use it or lose it principle. Okay, so you can sit down now, you can
Yes, those neurons and pathways begin to die.
This is a really, this is the basis of learning and memory. This is the basis of thinking, of emotional processing, of all of the things, of all of the cognitive behavioural neurotherapy. Everything depends on this principle of use it or lose it, or wire together and fire together. So we know that synaptogenesis is, where you're creating these new synapses. Synaptic pruning, just the same way that if a root of a tree is moving through soil trying to find input, and it can't find any input, so those people that weren't past the ball were getting no input, they basically will either die off, or they will go seeking, the root, like the roots in the soil, will go seeking input elsewhere. So these are all important principles of learning and memory, and the learning brain. So you guys are all in the teaching business. The learning brain, what's really interesting is that we don't necessarily grow more numbers of neurons. So there is some element of neurogenesis going on, so new neurons being born in the brain at any point in our lives. But more importantly, it's not about increasing the number of neurons as we grow and we learn. It's about increasing the number of connections between it. So what you can see here between a 1-month-old baby, so this is a very old, from a 2010 paper, but these are very old graphs from a long time ago when it was ethical to cross-section babies' brains and things. But and you never get to do that now. It's very inappropriate. But essentially, you've got 1-month-old baby to 4 years. Those neurons have grown a little bit in size, but have a look at all the outgrowths that are coming from those neurons. That's where the learning is. As the child processes new information, they're having thoughts, they're making connections that are in the world around them, they're actually making lots more neurons. And this whole concept of gaining new neurites and synapses and losing synapses is called neuroplasticity. Neuro meaning brain and plastic meaning it can be melted down and remolded. So this idea that neuroplasticity, our brain is actually shaped by our experiences, by our thinking, and by our choices. So you guys chose the direction that you passed those balls. You weren't by some predestined program told how to pass that. You made your own free choices. It's the same in the brain. You have your own free choice, this neuroplasticity. And what's amazing is that neuroplasticity was actually only discovered as a scientific concept and a medical concept about 40 years ago. And they were teaching that at Oxford and Harvard Medical School, that the brain that you were born with, the number of neurons and the connections between those neurons were hardwired. That actually, like all the other organs in the body, those were the number of cells you got, those were the number of connections, and that's hardwired. But what we now know is that the brain is incredibly plastic, incredibly malleable, and God knew this from the moment he breathed life into Adam in the Garden of Eden. He says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That you can actually change the way you think. Because remember at the very beginning we said, for as a man thinks, so is he. Right? You can change who you are in person, in character, with your worldview, with your opinions on things, your perspectives on things. You can change these by renewing your mind. You can change these by changing your thinking. I love the New Living Translation. It says, don't copy the behaviour and customs of this world, because the world around us is fallen, the world around us is full of stress and it's full of pressures, which we heard lots about. But let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Let God transform you. I find this really key. You know, I mean, I've been giving this talk for, gosh, how long? Several years. I think I've known some of you that I've presented to. But every time I do this talk, I always go through my slides and my talk each time so that it's refreshed and it's renewed in my mind. But each time I pick up something different, and I think that's, God has these little, moments where he turns the light bulb on for me. And this idea of let God kept coming to me last night while I was reading. Let God, let God. And this is really about, God standing at the door knocking, and he doesn't force himself upon us. He's waiting for you to invite him in, and those that invite him in will come and he will dine with them and then with him. That God he's given us free choice, just like the direction you pass the balls through the audience now. God's given us the ability to make our own choices, to have free will, and to me this is the very definition of love. If God wanted to hardwire us to believe in him, he would have just hardwired us that way, and we all would have had this, we have an angry centre in our brain, we have a loving centre in our brain, we have a God centre in our brain, but he hasn't hardwired us this way, he's given us this free will. And so if there is only one thing you take from this presentation today, is that you are in control. God has put you in control. Of course, he wants you to lean into him and root down into him and partner with him and work together in communion with him to do this. But ultimately, you're in control and your thinking is yours, and God implores you to, have a more Christ-like mindset. But when we have a look, we'll get to the renewing the mind. I'm going to go through all of the not all of the verses, there's over 200 of them, but where God implores us and encourages us to take dominion over our thinking, because he's given us free will, but of course he wants us to align it in a certain way. So I'm going to shift gears really quickly. I do want to take you through, a lot of this is common sense, but hopefully now when we talk about, this idea of brain health, healthy brain, healthy mind, I always say, that we've got the principles of healthy living, we've got the principles of how the neurons are working together and why they're such energy-hungry little, little units in there. But how do we go about getting the healthy brain? Well, what we know, and this again is Dr. Google, this is real empirical science that's been done over decades and decades. We know that a healthy brain, so the healthy biological substance of your brain, when it's healthy, we have improvements in memory, cognition, mental well-being, and we see this counteracting effects of aging. Our cells don't slow down the same way they do in our old age if we're keeping healthy living and healthy practices. What we also know is that the brain requires oxygen, it requires glucose, it requires nutrients, and the junk from the material that's sort of the side products, the metabolic, the junk that's made out of all of these these energy producing reactions within the cell needs to be removed from the cell. So I want you guys to have a think and maybe put your hands a week. You should be doing 20 minutes to 30 minutes of moderate exercise. Moderate meaning that you can do the exercise while still talking. You don't need to kill yourself while you're exercising, because that would defeat the purpose anyway. The physical exercise, but then also mental exercise. So the brain, although it's not a muscle, does behave like a muscle in that the more you use it, and you use different areas, because each of the different parts of the brain are responsible for governing different things. You've got a part of your brain that governs languages, music, dexterity, physical movements. If you're doing dancing or you're learning a new routine, or if you're doing a Sudoku as opposed to a crossword, you're using different parts of your brain. And by having a lot of varied cognitive activity, which you guys do because you're teachers and executives and you work in very demanding roles, I'm not concerned that you have you'll have cognitive decline anytime soon and not enough mental activity. But there's a very strong correlation between retirement and dementia. And one of the biggest risk factors, and also actually social interaction, and Dean talked about that as well as being a really important part of well-being, that actually when we're not socially interacting and when we're not thinking outside our comfort zones and we're not stretching ourselves mentally, that our cognition declines and the rate of dementia drastically increases. So keep yourself busy mentally and physically. Diet, of course. We know about the Mediterranean food pyramid. You can just Google that to read more about it, but essentially it's the most coveted diet through the decades and through all the fads that have come and gone diet-wise. This is the one that's really held true because it's a diet of moderation. It doesn't exclude anything, not even a glass of red wine a day or less, but certainly everything in moderation. And therefore it's sustainable and you're getting a bit of everything. But the other important ingredient is water. We need to drink water because actually in the very center of your brain, called the ventricles, is like a little pocket of fluid inside your brain called cerebrospinal fluid. It's about 98 to 99% water. So and oftentimes, in fact, dehydration, the reason you get a headache when you're dehydrated is because the pressure inside your brain changes, because you basically have lost, even if it's just a microliter of water change inside the brain, it can actually have quite drastic effects. So keeping your, good, excellent, people are topping up their water. So really important, and we're all Queenslanders, right? So we live in hot climates. We probably need to be drinking more and adapting ourselves seasonally. So it's really important to keep this, and for our kids, keeping our kids well educated on the importance of, water and that sort of thing. Thank you. Seems like a timely moment to do this. Thank you. And I'm also pacing. I'm told I pace a lot while I talk, but it's only because I need to get my steps up. So thanks for putting up with me. I forgot to wear my thing today, but no, that's you. I like to pace because it does, keeps you moving. Adequate sleep is another one. 7 to 8 hours is the recommended, and that's not just 7 to 8 hours of just lying in bed flicking through Facebook or taking a pill, a sleeping tablet. And I mean it doesn't mimic biological sleep if you're taking that, but essentially 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep is really the minimum of what we should be aiming for. There's lots of research on this. Breathing, low and slow breathing. This is really, really critical, not just because we need how much of our oxygen does the brain consume? 20%, okay? So not only do we need to get that 20% of oxygen directly into our brains and our synapses, but actually slow breathing, as they've only recently discovered in the last few years, that mechanism, that physical mechanism, the muscles that are activated and the nerves that are activated inside the neck and so on, actually decrease the activity in those sort of really excitatory parts of the brain. So the physical motion of breathing switches on the relaxation centers inside the brain at that neural kind of anatomical level. So if you're ever going into something really stressful, or you're trying to calm a child, or a vivacious teenager who's having a panic attack because the Wi-Fi's down or something, deep breaths actually help. Deep breaths help at so many levels. And we talked about this idea of, I think Dean had mentioned meditation and mindfulness. breathing is part of that mindfulness. Breathing is actually just stopping the monkey mind and everything going on and just focusing on, so let's just do 3 now, because actually it's important for me to regain my breath because I feel like I've been talking 100 miles an hour, but also just for you to get that feeling that when you're breathing low, and by low I mean down into your belly, because a lot of people, particularly those with anxiety disorders and so on, and there's this kind of loop inside the brain and the physiology, if you're only shallow breathing, you're actually telling your brain that you're in fight or flight mode. You're panicking, right? So people that are in this constant state of stress and duress will only shallow breathe to kind of the top third or quarter of their lungs. But if you're concentrating on really pulling your diaphragm down and getting that breath right down to the depths of your lungs, then you're having all these wonderful health benefits and neurological benefits. So let's just do 2 together. Okay, so breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, and try and take about 10 seconds, right? So in through the nose, right down into the belly, and out through the mouth. And again, in through the nose. Picture your belly expanding as you do it. And out again. It's actually easier, but it's harder than it sounds to do it, but it's something worthwhile practicing. Finally, renewing of the mind, and this really brings me into the last part of the talk. Renewing the mind. So this idea of rethinking stress. So the thing about stress is, if we really switch to think about our thinking now, what is it that really stops us from having that mental peace more than anything? What is it that prevents us from being, from thinking Christ-like, from being patient and kind and as empathetic as we'd like? The greatest roadblock, really, is stress. In some way, shape or form, stress is the thing that stops us from mentally thinking like Christ. But the thing is that we all live in, a world of, I could run the checklist of all the things being said about the recession and unemployment and inflation and having to sell my husband's concrete trucks because, the construction business has gone down, and apparently operating trucks is the worst thing you can be doing in this current economy. But all of those things, right, we can't actually get away from the stresses, relationships, work. I work with children with very severe disabilities and terminal illness, these children. These are things that we can't necessarily escape, but there's ways that we can rethink the way that we interact, the way we perceive things. And what a gift God's given us to be able to shift our perspective on the things around us, to transform our minds and to transform who we are and the way we are in character. Thoughts are extremely powerful. So if you were to, just to give you some, this is quite an extreme example, but those 70,000 thoughts that you have a day are very rarely had in isolation. Those individual thoughts have such power to actually change the physiology of your body. For example, if you're in a new neighbourhood and you're asleep at night and you're outside, you hear a scratching at the window, there is a tendency for a lot of people to think, wow, well, I don't know what that scratching is at the window. There's someone knocking, there's something banging, and it sounds like fingernails at the window. That thought that someone's standing outside your window from that one sound is going to elicit, your fight or flight response, your, the quick breathing, fast heart rate, sweaty palms, all of those things, that physiological response. But actually, you stop to think and go, well, actually, I'm in the middle of the forest, and those are just, or I've got lots of trees around my building, those are just the trees scratching at the window. So that's another part of your brain taking hold and saying, well, actually, there's no need to freak out. It's actually just the trees at the window. But that's a really powerful example, and it's extreme. But the difference between thinking there's a person there and the difference between thinking there's a tree outside has massive physiological ramifications. Now, stress is one of those things. You think about the adrenaline and the cortisol and the stress hormones that are floating around your body. If you're one of those people that tend to think instantly the negative, and you think that it's the worst case scenario, and you're catastrophizing situations and negatively thinking, those stress hormones actually have incredibly damaging and toxic influences over pretty much every cell in the body, not just neurologically, but it's linked. So people that have live in this fight or flight mode, it's higher cardiovascular disease, higher cancer, dementia, all of the big ticket items are linked to stress in some way, shape or form. So we know that thoughts react because of very physical responses, but what an incredible thing to think about our burdens or the problems or the things in our life that are otherwise quite stressful as actually, as blessings. So if I was to think about opportunities, so burdens as opportunities to shift our thinking, to practice the fruits of the Spirit. For example, we've all come up against, rude and, very impatient people in our day-to-day jobs. Might be students, might be co-workers, might be the lady at the checkout, or someone that's cut you off in traffic, or the person in front that was happened to me the other night. I have the kids after school. They're exhausted, they're spent. It's Friday afternoon, they had after school care because I had a meeting. They're exhausted and they're starting to just get really ratty at each other. I've got a trolley full of groceries because we've got friends staying for the weekend, filling it up, and the kids are starting to go off in the aisles. And I can see this checkout at the end. I've got my trolley full and I'm going for it. And this lady walks past, she can see that I'm just juggling everything. She's got 10 things in her little trolley. And she's like, I'm just going to zip right on in here. It's like, oh my gosh, I just need to, anyway. I'm just thinking, I'm not going to say, I was there, she basically bashed my trolley out of the way. It's like, okay, that's fine. Obviously, I hope it was going to take a lot longer. But things like, okay, I'm not even going to get upset. I'm just going to say, that woman's obviously got far more important things going on. She needs that checkout more than I do. So, you go ahead, lady, and I'll slot in behind you. But this starting small, right? This is this idea, if we want to really shift our perspective on the big things in life, then we have to start. You wouldn't run a marathon the first time you put your shoes on and run out the door, unless you're Forrest Gump. But you wouldn't do that. You would build it up and you do small bits, and you're really retraining that brain and you're rewiring those bridges to think positively. So I want to finish, I guess, by this idea of taking our thoughts captive and making them obedient to Christ. To how do we shift our thinking in all of these things going on? And I know the shopping trolley example is so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but like I said, I work with terminally ill kids every day and parents that are given terminal diagnoses in the most horrific circumstances. That essentially these kids have been born healthy and developed normally for a period through their childhood, and then they're given this, after a few stumbles and a bit of, lost vision and there might be a seizure, they think it's epilepsy. They're soon given this diagnosis that what their child actually has is this devastating terminal disorder, and basically their child is going to be wheelchair bound and fed through a tube within the next few years. And it's really not just one child. I'm working with families at the moment who's just had their third daughter diagnosed with this horrendous disorder. And it's really, I see my job as such a blessing. Even though I work with death and grief and the most horrific circumstances every day, I think I really do align with that thinking that, this is God's, I'm not in a job, God's given me a posting, and I'm just His conduit. He's given me this skill set, He's given me this knowledge, He's given me this passion to help people, He's put me in this post. And I need to not get down about the grief and, the difficult, these parents are going through, and it brings the worst out in some people, as you can imagine, but to actually just shift and go, right, well, how would Jesus, and my husband's like, you're not Jesus, but how would Jesus think in this situation? How would He manage this? How do I take captive every thought, marching through 70,000 thoughts a day? I could let one of those go down a rabbit warren, and this is where I believe the enemy takes his stronghold, is that the enemy can never corrupt your spirit, that sanction inside of you, that's God's. And we've all got it in there. Some of us are just really well connected to it, and some of us not connected at all. But the enemy can't get in there. But where he can get in and corrupt your character and corrupt who you are as a person is through your thinking. Through one tiny thought is all it takes. And you can go down that rabbit warren. If you don't unwire that bridge, unwire it. Remember the ropes? It's only ropes. It's not concrete and steel. It's only ropes lying across. You can cut those bridges. You can cut those ropes and rewire them. But if you don't know that you've got the capacity to do that, then actually you don't know that you can unwire away from those negative thoughts and rewire them towards Christ and to be more Christ-like. But how do we take every thought captive? How do we think so much like Christ that we don't even know where our thinking ends and Christ begins? How do we get to that point? It's through relating with him, it's through communication with him, it's through relationship with him. So we're rewiring those bridges. How do we do this? Prayer and meditation is actually one of the most powerful ways that we can spend time with God and actually rewire the substance of our physical matter of our brain, where you're actually performing this sort of micro-neurosurgery at the cellular level when you're in prayer and meditation with God. So when I say meditation, I don't mean the sort of bells and Tibetan symbol. I think that we've given this very new age concept to meditation in the current society, but really meditation is just focused thinking. If you can think about something, whatever that is, you're meditating on it. If you can think about just one thing, that's meditation. So if you're meditating on, thinking about God, or you're in worship singing a song and you're thinking about the wonderful things that God's doing in your life, that's meditation as well. So there is a group, how are we going to time? So I need to bring my phone. Okay, perfect. Okay, excellent. So essentially there's a group in the University of Pennsylvania. So this is a team of neurologists and neuroscientists, and they're collaborating with the hospital, and they have been for about 10 years running their studies. There's a very interesting book called How God Changes Your Brain, and a lot of this is based on the work that's written about in this book. Essentially, these neuroscientists and neurologists are self-confessed agnostic, so they don't prescribe to any particular religion, which I think adds to the credibility and the objectivity of the studies. And what they've found is they've taken lots of scans of people that are from different beliefs, so everything from atheists to Buddhists to Franciscan nuns and Pentecostal pastors and lots of different sort of religions and faith and spiritualities. And they've found that in Christian prayer, so I'm talking about Christian prayer and meditation now, because there's a lot on, like I said, the Franciscan nuns and the Pentecostal priests and so on, ministers, pastors. So what happens is there's 4 main changes that happen when somebody's in regular practice of prayer. So what they do is they'll take this person into an MRI scanner, so it effectively is measuring the change in blood flow. So if there's an indication of higher blood flow, it means that part of the brain is more active, it's attracting more blood and more activity to that area. So they'll take a baseline scan, and then they'll ask that person to go into prayer and meditation and whatever they do to be in that sort of prayerful connection time with God. And the 4 changes are quite profound. Firstly, what they see is that the person that's in that tube, in that having their prayer time with God under this scanner, it's as actually the patterns of activation and deactivation in the brain are identical to what you would see if you were a person having a conversation with another physical person. So the brain lights up as if God is a physical entity standing in front of them. That's finding number 1. Secondly, there's a part in our brain right behind your forehead skull that is called the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is really governing the higher order thinking, the higher order cognition, forward planning, rational thinking. This is kind of the very sound mind and seat of intelligence, this prefrontal cortex. What they see is that it's highly activated. In fact, in some cases over the course of the study that this only went for about 8 weeks, by the way. Sorry, 12 weeks, 8 minutes a day for 12 weeks. So this isn't a long running study with, where they're basically locked in a room praying for 12 hours a day. This is 12 weeks at 8 minutes of prayer a day is what they've seen over the course of the study. They saw neurogenesis in this area of the brain. The prefrontal cortex actually had what we think is the birth of new neurons. It increased in volume, increased in size. But these people also went, so they didn't just come out of the scanner saying, oh, I feel smarter, I think I can do a Sudoku a lot quicker now. Through neuropsych testing, they found that these people actually could think and have better cognition by the time, at the end of the study. They also found that this little part inside the brain, which is pretty much my favourite part of the brain now, neuroanatomically speaking, is called the ACC, or the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, which sits just behind that prefrontal cortex. And it's known as the heart of the brain. So it's the part of the brain that governs love and empathy and awareness of others and respect for others. And when they saw these parts of the brain inside a scanner, they're highly activated during prayer. It's lit up like a Christmas tree. So it's actually that this person, when they're in this loving, communion with God, is feeling more empathetic and feeling love. Conversely, the fear centers, which are right in the middle of the brain, which I haven't, there we go. You might have heard of the limbic system or the amygdala. So this is the part of the brain that governs this fight or flight response. The amygdala is essentially what we call the fear center. So it governs things like fear, resentment, bitterness. One of the words Dan used was revenge shopping after COVID. Maybe that's the bit that's activated, is you're going to go and revenge shop. But that's all coming from this limbic system and amygdala. So all of these negative emotions are governed by that. What they found during prayer is actually those parts of the brain are deactivated or disarmed. So when you're in prayer with God, it's almost biologically and anatomically impossible for you to feel fear and resentment and hatred and bitterness and so on, because you have two structures within your brain. It's like real estate. You can't be in two places at once. You can't occupy your fear center and your love center at the same time. It's one or the other. So in this case, the fear centers are deactivated. Finally, that is my fourth point. So we see it's like a conversation with God. We see activation of the prefrontal cortex, so better thinking, better cognition. We see activation of the love center and deactivation of the fear center. And really, if you think about it, that there is no fear in love. When we're in love, perfect love is driving out fear. When we're in this relationship, when we're in this prayer time, that love is actually incapacitating us from feeling fear. But, and see other things that happen here, there's health benefits. We see decrease in cardiovascular disease. People that pray and meditate regularly, it's well documented that we see a reduction in disease and illnesses and things like cardiovascular disease. Obviously stress and depression and all of those sorts of things are decreased. But in this study, whether you accrue these benefits or not, absolutely and fascinatingly depends on the kind of God you believe him to be. So if you believe God to be this sort of authoritarian, punishing, fear-mongering kind of God, you don't get those benefits, you actually get the opposite, so the fear center. So you're kind of praying out of fear of punishment, or you're praying out of fear of being struck down. That's not the kind of love, that's not the kind of God that I believe him to be, because the science tells me that when we're in a state of love, and if you believe God to be this benevolent, loving, empathetic, merciful God, then you will get these unbelievable benefits. I mean, that's just the science is telling us, this is, I think science is catching up with what we've known for, thousands of years through the Bible and as believers and as Christians. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. And there are those three elements right there. We have power in our cognition and our sound mind and thinking. If you think about it in this sort of, I guess, you can think of the love and empathy centre as really that fulcrum and that balance, because we still need our fear centres, by the way. That limbic system is really important. It's what keeps us safe. It's what keeps us aware of the surroundings around us and helps us to get the heck away if there's danger or if there's something that's not good for us. We know to get away from it. But we can't be all limbic system and we can't be all prefrontal cortex. We need a balance. And actually, physiologically, that AAC, that love centre, is the part that governs and is the highway between those two things. So I think it's a really nice visual. What happens when we're in that balance, when our limbic system is not in control and we're all balanced and love is at the centre of it, this is actually what happens. We have something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a factor, a chemical factor in the brain that's released that leads to synapse production, so new synapses, leads to neurogenesis, actually leads to growth in the brain and the ability for learning, memory improvements and so on when you're in this balance between, there's not this limbic system overdrive. Conversely, when we live in fear, that adrenaline and that cortisol actually stops the release of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's basically like fertilizer for the brain. So fear stops the fertilizer being released, love induces the fertilizer to be released. And I think if you just mind my babble, if you just think about that and take a photo of that or put, a mental image of that, that's pretty much the way God lives. And if you think about it, so we go back to this question of, okay, well, who is God? Is he loving? Is he not? I think, well, we're made in God's image, right? If he was not a loving God, why would he make us to flourish the way that we do when we're in this loving, peaceful, harmonious relationship with him and when we're feeling love and empathy towards others? In my mind, we're absolutely wired for love. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the spirit is life and peace, and the spirit obviously being the very embodiment of love. So again, the only other takeout that I think you should really, walk away with this afternoon is that we're wired for love. And if we, I've got one more verse that I'm not going to put up on the screen because we've had enough, but I just want you, now that you know this, and talk about this idea of thinking about verses in different ways and through different lenses and different filters. Each time I read the Bible, I get something new, right? As I'm sure we all do. But Philippians 4 says this, and I want you to think about, so now we know about positive thinking, rewiring our minds, thinking more like Christ. This is what Philippians 4 says. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So I just want you to take that away, and thank you for your attention, and I will happily take questions or comments. I think we're pretty at time, but thank you.